Hello and welcome. My name is Matthew Taylor and welcome to our spring bush broadcast. I'm joining you today from our Eurardy Reserve in Western Australia, which is about 145 k's north of Geraldton. We're on the lands of the Nunda people, who are the traditional custodians of the country that I'm on today, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians online with us today. We recognise that the remarkable Australian landscape that we strive to conserve is on land that's never been ceded, and its future is the responsibility of all of us working together. Now, this year marks the 20th, or next year, sorry, marks the 20th anniversary of Bush Heritage acquiring this wonderful Eurardy Reserve, which we got in 2005. And it's situated at the northern tip of the Western Australian wheat belt, and it's about an hour and a half north of Geraldton. It protects some wonderful York gum woodlands, some acacia shrublands, and some great heathlands. It's got some of the most amazing wildflowers, and I saw them on the way in. They're absolutely wonderful, and they're out in force. We also have the two people who are here looking after this fantastic reserve sitting next to me. We've got Sam Fischer, the reserve manager. Hi, Sam. And Fiamma Riviera, the restoration ecologist. So thanks, guys, for joining us. And despite the wind and the flies, you can judge how windy it is by how many flies we've got around us. Apologies for that, but that goes with the territory, doesn't it, when you're out in the bush? So if you'd like to use the chat function, as always, please put your name and where you're calling from in that to let us know who you are and where you are. And that's the right place to go and put any questions that occur to you as we're going through the webinar. We'll get to a Q&A at the end. And as always, if we run out of time, we will attempt to answer any questions we didn't get to afterwards. So let's kick off. Sam, I'd like to ask you to give us a bit of a background about Eurardy. I think you've been on reserve for 3.5 years, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And give us a flavour and a taste for what this landscape's all about.
Yeah. So you did a pretty good job at covering off on the high level stuff before there, Matthew. So yeah, Eurardy was purchased in 2005. York gum woodlands and Bong and Heath were some of the main vegetation targets that Bush Heritage was interested in on the property. It was a mixed use pastoral farming station prior to purchase. So there's a small area of cleared land on it, but the main appeal for Eurardy was the York gum woodlands, which are some of the oldest in the area, and they were preferentially cleared in the wheat belt for farming. And they're the sort of woodland that you see with the big, tall, old, gnarly York gums with the carpets of white and pink and yellow everlasting flowers that are out in, like you said, in force at the moment. Yeah. Then the Quong and Heath is the other dominant land system, and that covers about 70% or so of the property, and that's where you find all of the bright enigmatic shrubs of the Southwest Botanical Province, the verticordias, the bright purple melaleucas, some of the low mallees, some of which are only found on Eurardy, and yeah, the third land system is also the Bungabandy Creek, which we're actually situated in the head of at the moment. The Bungabandy Creek has strong cultural connections to the Nunda people. It is also host to a lot of our endemic orchid species in the reserve.
Excellent. Well, Fiamma, we call this webinar Reveg on the Edge, which is a catchy title. And I know that's one of your great interests. But I also know that the variables you're having to deal with here at this particular point means it's quite a challenge to do this restoration work, isn't it? Can you take us through what you've had to go through?
Certainly. So, as you said, we are on the edge. So one of the biggest thing we are on the edge of is the winter rainfall zone. So the winter rainfall zone is driven by cold fronts, which bring rain through the winter months. And where we are, it really varies from year to year how many fronts come through and how much rain they bring. So we have to deal with very variable rainfall. So, this year, great year. Sam's going to tell us a bit more, but that creates huge issues on the season that we have and how we respond to that. We have to be quite agile and innovative in how we respond to good and bad seasons. The other thing we're on the edge of is we're on the edge of one of the world's 35 global biodiversity hotspots. So the Southwest Botanical Province is known for its huge plant diversity. So that means that we have a huge number of species which we need to deal with, and it's which ones do we start in our re-veg? We can't possibly focus on the sort of 600 or so which are on Eurardy. So how do we go about maximizing that, but also keeping it just manageable? Within the Southwest Global Biodiversity Hotspot, we are on the edge of two biogeographic regions. So all of Australia is divided into these regions, and we sit on the edge of two of them, which means that we have really strong influence in our flora from both regions, which again drives this hyper-diverse flora and gives us really a wonderful headache. It's a wonderful headache to have. Which beautiful plant species should we return? But it also gives us very distinct soils. And so it's knowing how to treat each of those soil types as well. And we are also on the edge, as you mentioned, as both you and Sam have mentioned, of the agricultural region. So it's only 10% of Eurardy Reserve that was ever cleared, but that has left a legacy in those areas of weeds. Those attract herbivores, which in turn impact our re-veg, soil fertility through use of fertilizers. So it's now created this legacy that we have to deal with and be able to sort of come up with ingenious ways of dealing with. And finally, an unexpected one that really caught me, and I think caught all of us, particularly during COVID, is being on the edge of what is considered very remote Australia. This is a Fischer the official term. You're on the edge of very remote Australia, and that has huge implications for labour and equipment. Getting things up here is a big deal. How are we going to do the work, with what, and who's going to do it? And when you throw things in like good seasons or bad seasons in the surrounding farming district, even that has an impact on how we go about our re-veg. So to dealing with that.
That does sound like quite a challenge. And I believe we've got the northernmost wheat paddock in the wheat belt.
We do indeed. We were the most northern point of wheat, canola, sheep in terms of pasture sheep in the state.
Perhaps that's a project for the future. We get a little sign up saying northernmost paddock.
Yeah. And
Previously.
Yeah. So, Sam, tell us a bit about this revegetation project being undertaken and how rain is playing that inevitable role, about whether it works.
Yeah. So a little bit of context. The restoration project started in 2019. The previous reserve manager here, Ben Parkhurst, and his wife Tina really pioneered the project. So our partnership with Carbon Positive Australia started then. They're the main project partners for this project. They help us the flavour and the expert advice, things like that for project. In terms of rain, it's been very variable. The early years, when we first started in the restoration project, the first year there was a poor rainfall year, and as a result, it meant that we couldn't plant the full species of a suite of species that we had wanted to in our first York gum plantings, which meant that we had to go back and collect the acacia seed at a later date and do infilling. So that was one of the early sort of challenges that the project had faced. Yep. More recently, been a roller coaster the last 2 years here on Eurardy. Last year, so for me being here for 3.5 years, the first 2 years were really good. Average rainfall, which is about 280 millimetres a year, followed by one of the worst years on record in 2023, which was 65 millimetres.
Which we can see on the graph there.
Yeah, that graph there paints a very dire picture there. So as bad as 2006 there. And that has massive implications in restoration projects. And as Fiamma mentioned, coordinating logistics well in advance means that you the real struggle to pivot in years where you anticipate a poor year. So it requires a little bit of faith sometimes in some of this planning. But Fate this year has really paid off. So we've had an above average year in 2024. And as a result, we've had some really good success in the planting this year. So rain really plays a huge part, and not just rain, but soil moisture conservation. So it's not just how much rain is falls; it's making the most out of the rain that we get. As Fiamma mentioned, we're on quite the edge of the arid zone as well here, and so using soil moisture cultivation techniques pretty much the only reason why we can even attempt something like this in this part of the world. Using best practice moisture conservation techniques is incredibly important.
Excellent. Now we can see some pictures of some of the seedlings coming up on screen here. Fiamma, that's a challenge, isn't it? You mentioned remote Australia. What's it like trying to get vast numbers of seedlings at the right place at the right time? It's probably not as easy as people think.
No, yeah, but first of all, it requires planning 12 months in advance, at least. So we need to collect the seed first. So all our seedlings are grown from seed collected on Eurardy Reserve. So we have a team of Bush Heritage staff, Bush Heritage volunteers, positive staff volunteers, and also a case nursery in Perth, or a not-for-profit organisation who specialise in native plants. It's a huge effort to collect that seed. We then have to send it down to nurseries, mostly in Perth or nearby, because there simply isn't the infrastructure in the surrounding towns to grow that seed. So we have to get it down to Perth. We then have to find nurseries that want to grow very diverse species mix that we want up here.
Hard work, isn't it?
It's hard work. So one, it takes a lot of expertise on the nursery's behalf. But also we have to compete with carbon projects, with sort of more commercial carbon projects, which are very lucrative for nurseries because they have to grow 2, 3, 4 species for the same amount of money, as opposed to sort of growing the many species that we want to grow. So we've got that competition factor as well. And we then have to get more trucks back up here. So it's finding transport companies who have the capacity to deal with our precious seedlings to get back up here in good shape. And they can arrive in their thousands, in their tens of thousands. So it's also coordinating the timing of the deliveries. We have to have people here ready to receive them, to water them before they go into the ground. Coming up on the slide in front of you is the schedule for the delivery and planting of 250,000 seedlings that we had last year. As you can see, it was a very well scheduled, long mission. And as Sam said, all this work and then a bad season happens, but you're locked into that schedule because it takes so much planning. So it is a challenge to get that many seedlings ready and up here.
And part of that process is our partnership, isn't it, with a couple of organisations that are making this work together. Can you just tell us a bit about how that works? Carbon Positive.
Certainly. So as Sam mentioned, Carbon Positive, our restoration partner. So we have a really collegiate relationship. They're very happy to take on our ideas. We are very happy to take on their ideas, and we collaborate across all stages of restoration. So whether that is collecting seed, species selection, areas which we plant, etc. And as I mentioned, we work with a not-for-profit community organised nursery, a case nursery. We use some of their technical expertise. Carbon Positive also engaged the services of Dr. Jeff Woodall, who has decades of experience in post-agricultural restoration across the southwest.
Fantastic. Well, that relationship with Carbon Positive is something that has certainly made this initiative really work. They're a fantastic organisation, and I was able to catch up with their CEO, Louise Tarrier, recently, who we had a bit of a chat about what it's like working together as an organisation, providing the carbon credits and some of the workforce and some of the labour, but working in that tight partnership for a conservation outcome, as opposed to your more typical carbon project, which I was looking at last week in Southwest Australia, which is some of that early blue gum and sugar gum rows of trees in a monoculture, which was designed basically to make money. So instead of that, we've got this wonderful, rich relationship and a wonderful, rich, biodiverse set of plantings, haven't we? So let's see if we can get Louise's video up now. Hi, Louise. Thanks for joining us on the webinar today. How are you doing?
Thanks, Matthew. I'm fine. I'm doing really well, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here and to talk about the Eurardy project, because it's a project that's really special for Carbon Positive, and I know for all of Bush Heritage donors and team.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for spending the time with us. It is an amazing project, and I was chatting, in fact, before this webinar with the reserve manager, Sam Fischer, and our ecologist, Fiamma Riviera. And I mean, they were singing your praises. They were singing the praises of Carbon Positive and how wonderful it is to work. I think what they were saying was such a progressive, flexible and collaborative organisation.
Yeah, huge thanks as well to Sam and Fiamma and all of the Bush Heritage team at Eurardy. It is an extremely special project. And it's not just a special project in terms of collaboration, it's a special project in terms of the ecosystem restoration that we're trying to achieve on the site. Carbon Positive Australia has been planting in WA and in the region for over 20 years. And we have, I think, a unique insight into what makes a good project and how we can bring partners together to ensure that everyone can bring their skills and knowledge so that we get the best project delivery we can possibly get. We're a little bit unique. We have the word carbon obviously in our name, and we do measure carbon. It's a really important part of what we do, because we're very interested in how through planting we can actually get carbon drawdown. But we're a little bit different from your usual carbon project providers in that when we plant, we're looking to try and achieve a form of ecosystem restoration. And there are lots of different partners involved in that. So what Carbon Positive Australia brings is the partners necessary to provide the restoration work, but also the funding necessary as well to actually do the work, because this on the ground work is expensive.
And you're about to talk to us about some of the partners and some of the foundational players that are involved in this. I think that's an important part of the story, isn't it, to recognise what it takes to get something like this off the ground.
Yeah, and I want to start initially with Ben and Tina Parkhurst, who were at the Eurardy Reserve initially and who were really keen to see this restoration happen. That was when Carbon Positive Australia got involved, along with a really key partner to this restoration, Dr. Jeff Woodall. Yes. So without Dr. Jeff, this wouldn't actually be happening, because it's him who is bringing the skills and understanding of what is needed to provide restoration on a site like Eurardy. And so it's Dr. Jeff's knowledge of how to germinate, how to bring those plants and how to do that species selection that's enabling that to happen. We're also bringing other partners as well in terms of seed collection, assistance with the actual planting. So we've been very ably assisted by Pace Nurseries, who are down in the North Fremantle area. They, again, like Carbon Positive, have been around for a very long time, as have Bush Heritage, of course, as well. And I think it's the ability of all those partners to work together in a collaborative way that enables this project to happen.
The project as a whole is clearly driven by a desire to restore the landscape, and all partners are aligned behind that. But it's not just about putting stuff in, is it? You've got to keep track of it and monitor and measure the results, not least because there's some carbon credits involved at the end of the day, but more importantly because we want a really diverse heathland to be, created, don't we?
We do, exactly right. And so one of the big things that as an organisation we ensure in all of our projects, and obviously Eurardy is one of those, is that we monitor what happens afterwards. So what are the what is the tree growth, what is the survival rates, what is the crown cover, what is the diameter of the trees. And I think what really what the monitoring brings, as well as that, is it brings us knowledge of what works and what doesn't work. So that and particularly at a site like Eurardy, where we're planting extensive areas, knowing and understanding what works and what doesn't work, and being able to sort of tweak as you go in order to create a really great result is hugely important. So yes, we need to know, what the survival rates are. We need to understand from a carbon perspective how much carbon drawdown there's been, but ultimately what we want to understand is what works and what doesn't work, and how the trees are actually surviving and growing, not just over 1 year, but over multiple years. So it's going to give us a better understanding of the WA landscape overall, and a better understanding of how to plant in these areas that they're marginal. I'm going to be honest, they're marginal in terms of success rates. And so being able to bring that monitoring knowledge allows us to reduce risk over time as well, because we start to understand what's happening on the ground.
Well, it's wonderful to be undertaking a project like this, Louise, and it's wonderful to be doing it with an organisation like yours. Look forward, hopefully, to seeing you on the ground at some point.
Yes, lovely.
Thanks,
wait.
Louise. Cheerio. Bye. So that was a nice opportunity to talk to Louise there and understand from another perspective how an organisation that has its heart in conservation, but understands how you can actually use carbon credits to actually fund and help manage a wonderful restoration project like we're doing now. Now, of course, all this depends on these seedlings surviving and growing and capturing carbon. We've talked a bit about the challenges of rainfall already and the supply of seedlings, but what about other threats to revegetation? Sam, I know you have to manage some other ongoing threats, don't you?
Yeah, so part of my role as a reserve manager, not just within the context of revegetation on Eurardy, but more broadly is managing threats, and that can be through herbivores. Largely for restoration projects, it is herbivores. So some of the species that can potentially cause damage to our newly planted seedlings are your normal culprits that you would presume, like rabbits, introduced species, but also living on the edge, as the theme of today's conversation is, means that we have abundant wildlife in terms of kangaroos and emus as well, which as they do as herbivores will want to browse on nice new fresh seedlings that get planted in the ground. So those early years are particularly crucial in ensuring that browsing, and even within the context of emus, just walking down the roads when you rip a road to plant seedlings in, it's a nice clear path for an emu to walk, and it saves them having to get their
footprint, isn't it?
Yeah, it saves them having to get their legs scratched up walking through the weedy paddock. So they'll preferentially use it to walk along, and emus are very curious as well, so they'll often pluck out individual seedlings. So it's it's all those things that you don't necessarily think about, but we've used a few methods to minimise the impact of these species, and it was less of a problem in the early days of the red soil planting, but we found that the heath species that take a long time to grow need protection, need exclusion. So with the help of Carbon Positive and our team on the ground here, we've invested in exclusion fences in the last 2 years planting, and they have had a marked impact even in these early stages of monitoring. So we managed to remove all of the kangaroos and emus through mustering of them out of the fenced areas, and that only left rabbits really to deal with. And rabbits are part of our core herbivore management business on the reserve. So we've used a few techniques, but one of which has been something new and a bit novel, and has been brought on through needing to get rid of rabbits in a small area, has been using the use of fire to locate harbour. So in pest management, particularly with rabbits, the best way to remove them is to remove where they're hiding, which means that they have nowhere to hide and they'll move on. So using small scale burns, you can probably see a few in the photos here. to selectively remove small patches of vegetation, to locate the warrens, and then to be able to destroy the warrens and get rid of the rabbits that way has been really successful. And within the context of a paddock, it's just selecting those few little islands of just those couple of trees here and there where rabbits can find harbour and do extensive damage to the whole surrounding area. So that's been the real focus, and that's had some really positive results within the last couple of years of the re-veg, particularly in this yellow peaty sands.
Excellent. Well, in that case, let's move on to how you do the actual monitoring. And Fiamma, that's part of your job, isn't it? To keep track of that. Perhaps you can tell us some of the lessons that we've learned and some of the successes and failures, because we love to spruik our successes, because most of the time we are having successes, but the reality is it's not all great, is it?
Correct, correct. So as Louise mentioned, Carbon Positive undertake monitoring in the first few years, in the first 5 years, directly after planting. So this is very much because we want to know how much is surviving and what is surviving, how is it growing, so that we know what to plant the next year. And in our red soils, in our revegetation established in 2019, 2020 and 2021, that was all red soil York gum woodland that you see on screen now. The monitoring shows that an overwhelming majority of the seedlings survived, sort of 80% after the first summer, sort of down to about 70% after the second summer.
That's very good.
That is an amazing success rate. And that they are still persisting despite the harsh years. So we really thought that this year might drought a few of them out. Most of those eucalypts grew through the drought. So the monitoring shows us which species on those red soils are really doing well, and that the red soils are quite resilient to bad seasons.
Can you tell us just briefly the difference between a red soil and a yellow soil?
Certainly. So the red soils are found lower in the landscape, and they're much more loamy. And so loam is a type of soil particle that contains more clay and therefore holds more water, holds water better for longer. The yellow soils are sand, and they're have very poor water holding capacity, and much less clay. So on the yellow soils, what the early monitoring of Carbon Positives monitoring has found is that we had a very poor survival rate. We're talking about 10% survival rate. However, in areas where we put in, that we fenced in, even despite such a poor year, we did have a significant increase in survivorship. So for some reason, the yellow soils were just much more heavily grazed, heavily trampled, much more heavily disrupted. And we theorise that is to do with the species that are there. Perhaps they're just more palatable, more more attractive. And also the fact that the soil, as you can see here on screen, is just much more sandy and friable. So fencing in the yellow soils has really been demonstrated through the monitoring to be successful. And then this year, we actually put in place the first lot of bush heritage monitoring in our oldest revegetation. So that is to bring it into our standard vegetation monitoring. And we use the same methodology that we do across the whole reserve. And so that we can now make direct comparison between revegetation and intact vegetation, looking at things like species diversity and structure, and the spatial composition of our revegetation, as well as bird monitoring. So at the same time as we establish the vegetation monitoring, our long-term vegetation monitoring, which we will continue for decades as we monitor the rest of the reserve, we also have bird monitoring so that we can see that as the structure of the revegetation develops, are we attracting back the birds in the case of the red soils that we want. And we also compare that to unrestored paddock sort of control to see what would be.
Right. Fantastic. Sam, I think you were telling me last night you are actually observing some of that change and some of the bird life coming back into those even quite young woodlands.
Yeah, it's really encouraging, and whilst it is just on the edges where they still have access to some of the older country, it's yeah, really nothing better than driving along and then hearing weebills and red-cap robins and striated parlotes calling far into the planted areas. Very heartening to hear and see the odd, even this last year with some of the volunteers out doing re-veg monitoring, seeing nests in some of the trees that are only sort of 5 years old. Very exciting to see, and can only get better from here.
And I guess that's a measure of the functional nature of the re-veg, isn't it? That whilst we probably can't and really hope to put everything back as it was before, because it has been ploughed, if you've got a landscape that looks good and has functionality and the wildlife is using it, then you've achieved that ability to connect across distance, haven't you, and across landscapes.
That's correct. Yeah.
Well, Sam, we've talked a lot about variability, rainfall, the impact of restoration work. What's going to happen with climate change? Is that going to add an extra dimension to this challenge for you?
Yeah. Long story short, yes. Yeah. So yeah, this part of Western Australia, Midwest Western Australia, has a higher level of drought vulnerability in the long term outlooks, exacerbated by climate change. So the wheat belt generally in southwest Western Australia is going to be quite heavily prone to drought. So some ways that we've considered the approach in this restoration, some other practices might be to select provenance from more drought resilient areas. The issue that we run into is that we are the drought resilient area. We are on the northernmost extent of a lot of the species that are growing here. So by selecting provenance to Eurardy gives them the best hope that they can possibly have. That's where our provenancing of the seedlings comes into play, and the decision early on in the project to ensure that seed was only collected from here is going to pay dividends really. So that's in one part of the reason. And as Fiamma said, with this sort of restoration in such a biodiverse and complex environment, selecting species that are going to perform in the early stages has been really important as well. So whilst our initial plantings in some of the restoration areas might not be entirely representative of what was there, selecting species that are going to be resilient, build ecosystem function and help support resilient landscapes for the flora and fauna that are here have been some of the key criteria. And as you know, Bush Heritage will have this area for the long haul. So the aspiration with this restoration project is that we can continually add to it. So going back in the future and identifying opportunities to be able to value add into the base restoration that we've done to improve ecosystem function will be a key part of it. So those are some of the ways that we're hoping to manage some of the impacts that climate change might have.
So it's really quite a roller coaster ride for you guys out here, isn't it? All these variables, all these challenges, but
never dull.
You're obviously doing a fantastic job. There's a little side project, I guess, that Fiamma you've been working on, isn't it, around sandalwood? Can you tell us a bit about why sandalwood's important and what it is that you've been doing? Because we heard a bit about it in one of our Blue Sky podcasts, and it's a fantastic story. So can you enlighten us a little bit about pleasures of sandalwood?
Certainly. So Dr. Richard McClellan completed his PhD on sandalwood using bush heritage reserves in the Midwest as part of his research. Sandalwood's very important in the landscape as a focal point for many other species in arid and semi-arid areas. So part of his research looked at how sandalwood is a hub for insects, for birds, for ground-dwelling animals, for soil microbes, etc., which are really important in these semi-arid areas. However, sandalwood is used in the perfume and cosmetics industry. It has historically, over the last couple of hundred years, been harvested very heavily. To top that off, in order for sandalwood to reproduce, it needs its seed taken away from the mother plant, parasitic plant, taken away and buried. And the main dispersers, the main vectors for this were burrowing marsupials, which of course have largely disappeared from the landscapes due to cats and foxes and loss of habitat. So sandalwood populations are aging in wild. One of Richard's recommendations for persistence of sandalwood was to create managed populations. So which we thought we could do this here. We've got sandalwood on the reserve and we have the space to put in a managed population. So a couple of years ago, when there was a really good season, the sandalwood put out heaps of fruit. And Sam thought, I'm here, I'm going to take the opportunity to collect a whole lot of seed. You never know when we might need it. And sure enough, Carbon Positive came on board and we established a sandalwood grove, essentially. Our field officer, Ben Lake, did a whole lot of prep work, fenced it all off, created this little area, 11 hectares, where we now, this winter, planted the host plants, as well as the accompanying sandalwood seed. And the hope is that from that, eventually in the future, we'll be able to collect seed to perhaps establish other populations or for other landholders to establish populations as well.
Fantastic. And is there any evidence yet that they're coming up? They're coming through?
Oh, I think Ben Lake had cheekily dug one up and saw that it had put down a nice big fruit. So that is
couldn't wait.
Couldn't wait. It's
excellent.
It's his baby. So that's very encouraging to see. It was a nice wet year, which optimum year for putting them in. So fingers crossed that we get another good follow-up next year for them to persist.
And what's it parasitic on? What species? Is it a variety?
A variety. So acacia hosts are really what they like to get going on, but their roots go everywhere. Their roots go absolutely everywhere. So they really make the most out of their environment.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, guys, for giving us that insight into what's happening here at Eurardy. We've had a wonderful little flood of questions coming through, so we'll try a fairly rapid-fire way to answer as many as we can, if that's all right with you. First question was back to the fencing when we excluded the kangaroos and the emus. A very fair question, I think, is will we let them back in again afterwards? And when is afterwards?
Yeah, I'll take that one, Matthew. Yeah, so the intention behind all of the exclusion fencing on the reserve is that it's reusable. So from a management perspective, fencing's expensive, and Carbon Positive's been really supportive in helping establish those fences. So our aim is that once the yellow soil plants that we've planted in these fenced areas are well established enough, they're resilient enough to the effects of herbivory, that we'll be able to take them down and reuse them because, expensive business and kangaroos and emus are definitely part of the landscape, but are just a little too destructive in the earlier stages of our plantings when we really need to have them out of the way.
So just a temporary measure. They'll be back. They'll be back. Excellent. And a question about the restoration work, and this talks to the heart of the relationship with Carbon Positive, which is that who pays for it? Do Carbon Positive? Fiamma, can you just give a succinct sort of explanation of how that works, that relationship?
Yes, certainly. So Bush Heritage provides the land, obviously. We provide my time, Sam's time, Ben's time. There's a lot of Bush Heritage staff time. We provide some of the equipment. We provide the infrastructure. Carbon Positive provide a lot of the staff to come and do the seed picking and the planting, the labour, as well as the seedlings. So they pay for those seedlings as well. Yeah. So it's a really nice sort of like sharing of costs, benefits, and risks. Yeah.
And of course, we get some wonderful Kwong and Heathland or something like that.
Exactly. Yes, because revegetation is an expensive business. So,
and what funds it ultimately is selling the carbon credits, which go to fund the whole thing.
Exactly. Yes.
Fantastic. Well, we've got a question here from someone who's obviously been to Eurardy and very invested in the place. Keen on the donuts. And there was a plague in 2022 of house mice, which might have been linked to the lupins. The question is, was that a plague? Was it just some occasional house mice? And do we know how the Dunarts are doing?
Well, I'm ashamed that I can't quite tell who's asked this question. Hello to whoever that is, because obviously we've worked together quite recently. So house mice are one of the species that benefit really well from disturbed landscapes. So in red country, you find that house mice aren't nearly as prevalent. But so house mice will generally breed up in those cleared paddocks. 2022 was the second good year in a row. So 2021 was really good as well, which meant that the house mice had bred up to high levels. And for context now, we caught one house mouse in our week of fauna trapping last week to that person. So they very much ebb and flow in response to environmental conditions. In terms of Dunarts, you'll be pleased to know we've caught the odd flat-tailed Dunart in the restoration areas, which is really encouraging.
Oh, excellent.
We're hoping in future years, once we start trapping in the planted yellow soils, that we might see some of our other Dunart species, the hairy-footed and the long-tail. But that'll be a watch this space. Join in for the next webinar in a few years' time, perhaps. To find out more about that.
Dunart, fantastic. Well, linked to that was a question about frogs, and it's obviously also from someone that's been here. Have you found any more rare frogs, Sam?
No different ones. The rare frog that this person's referring to is the southern sandhill frog, which was first caught on Eurardy in 2018 by our previous manager, Ben Parkhurst. But we actually, now that we know what we're looking for, we're finding tracks of them pretty much everywhere. So very heartening to know that they're rare but locally abundant. And Megan put up a lovely photo of the little southern sandhill frog.
It looks like he's quite at the sandy soil.
Yes, yeah. Well, he's unique in the sense that he completes his entire life cycle. So his tadpole stage through metamorphosis in a mucous membrane in the damp sand. So no puddles required for this frog.
Very well adapted. Okay, from animals to grasses. Question here is, do grasses coming back, is that the result of planting them, or do they come back on their own seed banks, mating in the soil? Fiamma, perhaps for you.
Oh, yes. Well, a little bit of everything. Yes, grasses come back, but not all grasses are good, because obviously, being a post-agricultural landscape, weedy grasses have come back and are present. So great brome and wild oats are two classic ones. However, being a disturbed landscapes, there are such things as disturbed native landscapes, for example, after fire. Native grass species which like disturbance have come back. So kerosene grass is an example. So there must be some sort of residual seed bank of disturbance species that perhaps is still there. Having said that, our paddocks are surrounded by intact vegetation. So it is possible that there is also some exchange still happening with those intact areas. Certainly, we encourage the native grasses. We want them there, particularly in the woodlands. Woodlands are quite open. So in nice, open, sunny spots, you would get native grasses. And as Sam mentioned earlier, returning different functional aspects of the woodland is certainly part of our intentions going forward. Grasses being one of them. So watch the space.
Fantastic. And a very pragmatic question on all those seedlings coming in. How do you keep them, and once they're planted, how do you keep them watered? Or is it a case of once in, they get a drink when they go in and that's it?
No, way more harsh than that. Once they go in, that's it. They're on their own. Yeah. Okay. The scale that we're at is just simply too big to water them all. Yeah. And water is limited up here, so we can't pour water on them. It's too salty. We'd have to collect enough rainfall. So it's tough love.
Yeah. I might be able to elaborate a little bit more on that too. So the soil moisturization ripping techniques that we use channel water, so it creates a catchment, however small that is for the seedlings like we plant, and we do the ripping just after the first rains of a year. So between the ripping taking place and the planting occurring, we have opportunity for rain to collect and the soil moisture profile within those rip lines to build up. So that's sort of like providing a little bit of a watering
Bit of a head start.
Yeah. So
Yes, that's
so
fantastic.
that's all considered within the preparation practices leading up to planting as well.
Excellent. Now, I know this may not be direct area, but a question about monitoring the birds. Are we using acoustic recorders yet on Eurardy, which we're doing in a number of properties across Australia, or are we relying on traditional bird surveys?
We do both.
Excellent.
We do both.
Excellent.
Yes.
Fantastic. And another question linked to that was, are we doing reptiles and insect surveys? Because I guess this is coming from somebody who hears a lot about birds and would like to know how the other groups of animals are doing.
Yeah, I can jump in on that. Invertebrate surveys, not within our repertoire of expertise at the moment. Probably something valuable to consider in the future, given some of Richard McClellan's work on sandalwood and recognising that insects play a really important role. Reptile surveys, they definitely fall under our annual fauna monitoring, which has in recent years been expanded to include the restored areas. Prior to, it was largely just within our remnant country, but now we've been doing surveys there. And I can report having done it just last week. We catch a host of reptile species. The reptiles quite enjoy some of those modified landscapes species like netted dragon, a couple of species of skink, including Tenotus pantherinus, very common in the cleared areas, and the odd blind snake as well. So I look forward to seeing how that grows over time. That's the extent of our other fauna in the restoration careers.
Fantastic. Well, there's a nice question here about First Nations practice and cultural learning. Is that something that is anticipated in our planning, that the re-veg itself will fall into cultural bird plan? So that's probably a long way out, but
I mean, that's a tricky question, and we have brought it up with Carbon Positive, and they're really open to this conversation. But obviously, the revegetation has a carbon value, and so there's strict conditions about and contracts with regulators about how long that carbon has to be maintained for. But certainly, both ourselves and Carbon Positive appreciate that fire is part of the landscape. And that we can't just exclude fire forever. So those are definitely ongoing conversations. And in particular, engaging burning practices is something that we really want to look into. At this point in time, everyth's still pretty little. We want to keep the fire out for now.
Well, Ben who works there as well, was telling me last night that there's so much work going on with the local London people on new properties around the place where they've got access to through their IPA, that this sort of question is one they'd love to get to, but it's not right now. It's in the future. So the challenge of getting access, isn't it?
So much happening. Yeah.
All good. We are getting a lot of questions coming through about the carbon credit process. It's quite a complex story, so we're more than happy to do a response explaining more details about how that system works, and we're very happy to send that through to people who ask questions about that after the webinar. Likewise, we'll do that with any other questions that we don't get to. A last couple we'll see if we can get to. Now, this is a really specialist one. What do we know about the fungal networks in the environment here? Have we had anybody examine that?
No. Not with regards to fungi in particular. We have had an honour student, part of a bigger project, which also included some of our southwest reserves, looking at the soil microbiome more broadly, between restored and unrestored areas and restored areas of different ages, hoping that there'd be some change. And unfortunately, it showed that no, there wasn't. So that was looking at microbiomes more. Certainly, there's been a lot of work in tax systems on the importance of mycorrhizal fungi, for example, and the role that they play in nutrient acquisition, in pathogen resistance, etc. But how that extends to restoration, not just for Eurardy, but across the industry, is definitely a hot topic. And it's a question of scale. How do you take a little bit of fungus, a beneficial fungus, and then put it out over a whole paddock? So it is very much a growing research space, which we are paying attention to.
Fantastic. Question about how we control weeds between the planted vegetation. Sam, is that something that either of you could talk to?
Yeah, I can give a bit of a brief overview. So in terms of weeds, there's a few considerations we make. One, the preparation stage. So paddocks get sprayed out the year prior to planting. That's to reduce the weed load and build up soil moisture. Again, soil moisture is the aim of the game in this, saving every drop you can. And then a follow-up will be done in the year of planting to knock out those germinants that come up in the year that we're ready to get planting. And then obviously the soil moisture conservation cultivation techniques. So coming along and doing the ripping just before planting takes away that weed seedbed, pushes it to one side, so to minimise the amount of weeds that we're about to plant. So that gives the plants the best chance. In terms of follow-up, we've developed, it wasn't too much of an issue on the red soils early on, but considering how some of the yellow soil heath plant seedlings that we're putting in take so long to grow, we've had Dr. Jeff Woodall do a couple of agricultural style field trials on selective herbicides that might be able to be used to remove some of the most competing weeds out of the system to give the seedlings in the yellow soil a bit of a chance. But given the history of the last couple of years of planting in the yellow soils, with last year's being fairly poor in results and very few weeds to spray, we haven't really had to use those techniques just yet. And then it's worth mentioning as well that lastly, our long-term weed strategy in these restored areas is ultimately that of exclusion that you see we're already seeing. You might have noticed in some of the photos that have been playing in the background that eventually species like York gum will drought out underneath their canopies and where their root systems are, and that reduces the weed burden quite extensively and gives opportunity for smaller annual species like wildflowers and the grasses Fiamma had mentioned that are much more adapted at managing in that environment to take hold. So there's probably another little project in helping facilitate the annuals in the works, but those are some of the methods that we use for weed management in those areas.
And in the areas between the ripped lines, the furrows, do you get anything other than weeds coming up, or do you have any natural?
Yes. So interestingly, not all native species are good. So yes, we do have native species. We have one called Tylotus polystachys, Wales feather. Sometimes it looks like we are growing a crop of it. It comes up so well, but it's a native species. It's a native disturbance specialist.
Okay.
So you do have native disturbance specialists which pop up. Makes it tricky. How do you deal with them? But yes, certainly we do get native species also come up. Salt bushes, for example, tend to come back in the red soils quite readily by themselves. Which is excellent because you would find them in the intact systems. Some of the wild tomatoes also come back on their own. So yeah, that's always encouraging to see. On the yellow soils, much more limited natural recruitment. Much more limited natural recruitment.
Got you. Well, I think we've covered a good chunk of the questions there. So it's probably time to wrap up the webinar for today. Thank you so much for responding to the questions, and it's obviously a fascinating project that people will want to keep track of over the years. We will, as I said, get in touch with anybody whose question wasn't answered. and give you our best go at giving a response to that. One last thing I'd like to do is, before we get to our lovely closing video, is ask a question. I think there was a picture it came up, but I don't know whether, Megan, you were able to bring it up, but there was an adaptive Reveg cedar devicey thing with 3 people sitting on it, going at speed along the lines with everybody popping seeds in. That sounds like a glorious piece of clever adaptation.
Yeah, so here we go.
Here we
Megan's
go.
got some photos here. Here's myself and Dr. Jeff Woodall. This is definitely worth mentioning, a brainchild of Dr. Jeff Woodall sitting there. The aim of this is to help speed up planting on scales like this. This is our tractor out in some of the yellow soils here, planting with 2 of the pace crew on the back. You can see they're putting in seedlings from those nally bins mounted into a what is a bit of modified horticulture machinery for vegetables, planting away there. So this is one of the many benefits of having such knowledgeable experts like Dr. Jeff Woodall on the project, is that we can facilitate trialing things like this, being a bit innovative, and sometimes we have big wins, which is one of those. Was definitely a big win.
Well, to me, it looked like that was enormous fun, but Fiamma, I gather it's actually bloody hard work.
Yes. Look, I only watched the crew do it, but the crew on this, it moves at pace. You have to keep up. You're putting those seedlings in, and if you miss one, it's got to grab the next one. It's a whole quite stressful process to keep going at that speed. Yeah. But as Sam said, I think everyone just really appreciates the innovation behind it, and
Well, it's fantastic to see that all at work in what's an outstanding project. That wraps us up pretty much. I'd like to just to finish off with, let everybody know that we've recently launched our annual impact report. It's a wonderful document you can access online. Megan will put the link into the chat. It's really celebrating you as much as it's celebrating what Bush Heritage is able to do, because with your support, we're making great strides towards our 2030 goals. And as of writing the report, we're up to managing just short of 1.5 million hectares of land that we own. We're contributing with our traditional custodian partners to managing over 10 million hectares. And the biggest growth area is the agricultural land, where we've been engaged to produce biodiversity assessments and provide advice. And there's about 10 million hectares of that land. So in a short space of time, we've been able to significantly increase our impact, our conservation impact, and that's thanks to you. Thanks to your support, thanks to your donations, thanks to all of you who think of us in your will, and for all the pro bono advice and the wonderful volunteering that goes on. We'd like to ask one last little fun request, if you would. Channel 10 has launched a Marsupial of the Year competition. It's a deliberately competitive thing, but it is for the benefit of all charitable organisations working in the conservation space. We're part of that, and we've been allocated one little beast. It's the brush-tailed phascogale, which is a fascinating animal. And if you'd like to have a bit of fun and join in, then please vote for which is your favourite critter or your favourite organisation. And the ones that come out top, I think it's the top 5, will all get donation. And so if you'd like to go and see what it's all about, Megan will put that in the chat link. And there's also a nice article in The Guardian today, which interviews our CEO, Rachel Lowry. So it's a bit of fun. Please do that if you'd like to. And of course, you're welcome to vote for any organisation or any animal that captures your fancy. That's it. Thanks again, folks, for joining us. We've got a lovely slideshow to finish off with, and it's a handcrafted, hand-picked set of flower pictures, which Fiamma had a big role in doing, because she's not at all biased towards plants, which just shares with you some of the joys of the wonderful wildflower season here in the West. I'm going to go out now and have a look around myself, and appreciate that. Thanks all for joining, and we look forward to joining you next time for our summer webinar, which we anticipate being from far north Queensland. Thanks, folks. Cheerio.